History can be found anywhere, even in your own backyard. So join us as we search the land looking for the stories that helped shape this nation. Come on the porch, grab a drink, and join us for a little bit of history from the homestead. Hey there, history buffs, and welcome to this episode of the History from the Homestead podcast. Today, we are talking to author Robert O'Connor about his book, Jeep Show, A Trouper at the Battle of the Bulge. So, Robert, welcome.
Thank you so much, Thomas. It's really great to be here to talk with you and your audience.
So before we dive in here, let's tell me a little about yourself.
Sure. I am a full-time writer at this point. I made my living mostly in the marketing trade up until then, but about 8 years ago, I wrote a nonfiction book related to the topic of morale. And that got me interested in the Morale Corps in World War II in the U.S. Army. So now I am essentially a writer.
So we'll mention that because if you look at the front page of the novel, the way Trouper is spelled with a U instead of two O's, that give you a little hint about the subject at hand, I too believe.
Yes, very perceptive.
So, well, this is actually my first show that we've covered American history overseas, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, but we're going to talk about a little bit more behind the scenes. You know, a subject even I wasn't fairly familiar with. So, well, Robert, let's there were some big names in your book even about the Morale Corps. So let's dive in with them first off and hear some of those stories.
Sure. I'll start with just a step back and say the Morale Corps was part of the Army Services Forces. There are essentially three groups in the Army: the Army Service Forces, the Army Ground Forces, and the Army Air Force. The ground forces were the combat troops, infantry, artillery. The service forces were logistics, quartermasters, transportation, personnel, and then what I call in the book the Morale Corps. That was actually its name until 1942, and it was changed to Special Services. But they were part of the Army Service Forces. And the Army went to great lengths to try to entertain its soldiers. Back in the States, when soldiers were in training camps, and these are young men and they're kind of bored, full of energy and all that, the Army went to great lengths to try to keep them away from uh, houses of ill repute and low-end bars and gambling joints in towns adjacent to army bases, and those things sprung up. And then overseas, uh, much the same for the soldiers in the rear echelon. But Thomas, the combat soldiers at the front posed a difficult challenge because, first of all, after the summer of 1944, they moved so quickly to right up to the German border, and the transportation just couldn't keep up with it. Secondly, they were in artillery and sniper range of the German forces almost at all times. So to try to entertain those soldiers, the USO, which did great work during the war, we've all heard of the USO and the Red Cross, simply could not go there. The Army had this group called the Morale Corps. They were a bunch of them, including the protagonists in the book, were in a big Army show called Hip Hooray with a band, and very fancy show that was they were shipped over to Europe to do this show, probably in Paris for soldiers on leave. But as soon as they got there, the Army, as it does, changed its mind, broke them up into Jeep show units. And there were a couple of dozen of these units. And these soldiers in the Jeep show units were MOS, that is Military Occupation Specialty 442, enlisted entertainers. And the Jeep shows were actually the idea of an officer in the Army who had been a very successful Broadway director. Joshua Logan directed South Pacific, Cabaret, Mr. Roberts. And his idea, since he had a show business background, even though he was a colonel, was to break this big show up into three-man Jeep show squads. And the way they would operate is the three entertainers would get in with a driver and they would drive to just behind the front lines where the combat troops would be brought back for a hot meal, possibly a shower, possibly a uniform exchange. And they would do essentially small, almost vaudeville-like variety shows. So one of the enlisted entertainers would have an instrument. Often it was a guitar, and the other two, they'd sing and they'd tell jokes and do impressions. And they would always pull a soldier out of the audience to perform, what talent he might have that his buddies wanted to see him perform. And then they would go on to the next outpost. And on some days, they would do as many as 11 shows. Uh, Interestingly, there was one superstar, Hollywood star, that was an enlisted entertainer, and that was Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney was the worldwide #1 box office draw in 1939. And here in 1944, he was driving around in a Jeep near the German border doing pretty corny but well-received Jeep shows. And he uh, uh, he he did not have to do that. He could have joined the army and stayed in Hollywood and produced films for the Signal Corps, but he chose to get all the way involved. Some other names of and Mickey Rooney was obviously extremely famous before he joined the army. Some of the other enlisted entertainers became quite famous after the war, but while they were serving, they were professionals, but they were unknown. So if you know the movie Young Frankenstein, you know the name Mel Brooks. He was a enlisted entertainer. Sammy Davis Jr. was an enlisted entertainer, and actually may have broken the color barrier in the United States Army, which was segregated in 1944. And yet Sammy Davis Jr., as a black man, was part of a integrated Jeep show squad. Um, Red Buttons was a famous comedian in the 50s and 60s in America, had his own popular television show. Burt Lancaster, Dick Van Dyke, Don Knotts, many, many, many them went on to become well known. And then most of them, like the protagonist, were not stars while they were in the army, and they did not become big stars. Some of them stayed in show business, some of them didn't. But that was the morale corps. And Thomas, what I found is it's just not known. The USO is rightly famous for the work it did, and the Red Cross is rightly famous for the work it did during the war, but very few people know about the existence of these enlisted entertainers and the work they did.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, until I read your book, I had no idea of it. I like most people was familiar with the USO, but
Right.
not the Jeep shows. I imagine these were even exceedingly dangerous, being at the front line in the Battle of the Bulge, which is arguably one of
Yes.
the biggest battles. out there.
Yeah, the protagonist in the book, the enlisted entertainer named Jim Tanzer, um, actually gets left in one of the after one of the frontline shows in a little bitty town on the German border of Luxembourg called Hosingen. By accident, he gets left behind, and his Jeepso squad has to leave without him. And he then wakes up the next morning in Hosingen to the sound of German artillery, quite a barrage which preceded the attack we call the Battle of the Bulge.
Um,
So yes, it was quite
yeah.
dangerous.
Now these enlisted entertainers, for the audience, did they go through basically the same boot camp as just a soldier would have went have, or
Uh,
how did
they
that work for them?
they did. They would be inducted and go to an induction camp, like all soldiers. They were specifically trained at after basic, after 8 weeks of basic, they were spent to a camp in Alabama called Camp Siebert, Sibert. And Camp Siebert was for two specialties. The chemical corps, which was concerned with gas attacks, and then the morale corps or special services. And once they were gathered as the morale corps special services, yes, they were still, going to the rifle range, and they were still going, doing the obstacle course and the basics, but most of their time was preparing for their jobs overseas. And as I said, they thought they were going over as a big show, and they thought they would be doing a lot of producing of amateur theatricals for soldiers in the rear echelon. As it happened, when they got over there, as we discussed, they were they were broken up. The big show was broken up, and they were put into Jeep shows.
I
But
see.
they were trained. They knew how to fire a gun. Now, one time, Mickey Rooney showed up for morning reveille holding an umbrella, not his gun. But he, even though Mickey Rooney went through everything everybody else did, he was a Hollywood superstar and got away with things that the rest of the other soldiers could not have.
Sometimes it's helpful to be known.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
and I asked that because I'm sure they carried their sidearms at the very least, and or their
Yeah.
rifles or whatnot, as well as their guitars, their accordions, or their
Yeah.
joke book or whatever their prospective talent was that they
Right.
um
Yeah, they did indeed carry their M1 Garands. I think also the M1 carbine was popular with the M1 carbine was a little smaller than the Garand, a very good defense weapon, and officers and artillery men often carried the carbine. So these entertainment soldiers were armed at all times. They didn't wear their, they didn't hold their rifles while they were performing, but they were nearby because at any point they knew they could come under attack. And by the way, they were especially nervous after the shows driving back in the dark in their open Jeep, worried about German special forces or German snipers who may have snuck through the lines. So yeah, they kept their rifles with them.
now would they camp with the frontline troops after a show, or would they get long gone back.
They would, in general, they would stay. They weren't sleeping on the ground. I will say that. But, let's say they're doing shows at company strong points all along the German border in Luxembourg. They might do 10 shows in one day and then stay at the company headquarters in whatever little town they were in, which would usually be a hotel that has been taken over or a church or something like that. So they weren't they weren't in comfortable beds, but yeah, they would stay. And then if they were finished in that sector, they would probably drive back. And one place where they would be headquartered around December, interestingly, was Bastogne, because Bastogne was more an army group headquarters.
Yeah. And how long would a show typically last? Because
It
I
would
imagine
typically, yeah,
being front
it,
line, there's not a lot of time to do a
right,
5 hour
right.
show.
No, they're not doing a 5 hour show. The show would be about an hour, and then a very important thing, Thomas, is they would hang around. And I was studying Mickey Rooney's squad, researching that one. He would hang around and talk to the GIs and sign autographs, and they had yo-yos or baseballs they'd take along and give them out. And what I found was the show was appreciated, and if it was Mickey Rooney, it was pretty funny. But it wasn't really the show. It was the fact that these guys had come all that way to be physically present with these combat soldiers, and just to sit down and shoot the breeze with them after the show, and give them something to write home about. You can imagine a 19-year-old kid, on the German border who hasn't, pretty new to it all, and he gets to talk to Mickey Rooney and write home to his girlfriend about it. So it was the being present as much as doing the show that helped with morale. Because frontline troops often didn't, they were isolated from the other troops. They were often, they slept outside, as you mentioned. They were, it was very uncomfortable. This was the coldest winter in Europe in 80 years. And of course, they were constantly under threat of being wounded or killed or taken captive. And because they were so far away from the main supply bases, they didn't get they didn't get all the good equipment. They didn't get all the good clothing. They didn't get all the good food. Uh, they had to make do with what could be gotten to them. So the fact that these entertainment soldiers would take the time and the risk to come up and spend time with them and entertain them just meant the world.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I because you'd think about a lot of those young men had been fighting since they landed, in France at
Yes.
Normandy.
Yeah. 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 The
What
28th the 28th division, Thomas, which is the division that I put the book's protagonist in, fought in Normandy in France, fought all the way through, and then had a desperate time in a battle called the Hurtgen Forest in September and very early October, a very bloody stalemate in the northern Ardennes, and they were sent to the Luxembourg area, the border, as much for rest and refitting as to guard the border. So they were stretched very, very thin. So yes, the combat soldiers who had survived that long had seen it all. And the other thing that happened is some of these young men were replacements. So they were, after the Hurtgen Forest, where there were significant casualties by the 28th and the other divisions involved, they move on to the Ardennes area and they get hundreds of replacements. And these are green soldiers who have never been in combat and who have to be taught, the real world basics of fighting and surviving. And the veteran combat men did not welcome the replacements because they didn't trust them. They only trusted their buddy. So for the replacement, you had to survive combat for a week or so. And once you did that, you weren't a replacement anymore. You were one of the guys, you were one of the buddies. But for the first week, it was very dangerous.
yeah. Yeah, and you think, those young guys you know, when we got involved basically after Pearl Harbor, they were still in high school. They were just high school kids.
Absolutely.
A lot of them wouldn't
Absolutely.
even had a driver's license yet. They would have been,
Absolutely.
that's
Absolutely. And
wild.
Thomas, the Army was a cross section of America as a whole. The Navy and the Marines did not use the draft until late 1944. So they kind of cherry picked who they wanted from the American population. The Army was much larger than the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Army Air Corps combined. So the Army had to depend on the draft. So they got everybody. They got, young men from impoverished Southern backgrounds. My father told me that there was a boy in his barracks who told him that the Army boots were the first pair of shoes he'd ever had, all for his own. And they got boys and young men from the bustling Midwest and just all over the country. They drafted PhDs and they drafted immigrants that they had to teach English to, so that the immigrants could follow the orders of the country they were defending. So the Army was a cross section of the nation as a whole, and because of that, quite interesting from a sociological standpoint.
Oh
And of
my, yes.
course, these were unlike the British Army, the German Army, or the Japanese Army, let alone the Russian Army. These soldiers never forgot that they were citizens. They were essentially citizen soldiers, and so they never forgot that. They voted in elections. They had a healthy disdain for most of their officers, and and a very healthy disdain for military hierarchy, which they called chicken shit. Um, and yet they did their job. When called upon, they did their job. So the composition of the American Army and the general attitudes I found to be absolutely fascinating.
um, yeah, more curiosity than anything. But was there anything similar to Jeep shows like in the Pacific? Because it'd have been a lot different
Yes,
because that was an island hopping campaign
they
more
would,
than
yeah.
anything.
So it would be they'd be going on PT boats, I think, or they'd be getting to the islands on small destroyers or in some way. But so they weren't cheap shows, but yes, there were enlisted entertainers serving in the Pacific as well. I think because the distances in the Pacific are so vast, um, and these islands are scattered all across this vastness, that there wasn't the same penetration of any kind of entertainment that there was in the European theater.
Right. I mean, a completely different animal. That's why I was
Right.
wondered. I guess you have to call that
Yeah.
one the boat show, I guess.
Yes. A,
Um,
a very famous entertainer in the 50s and 60s, a gentleman called Danny Kaye. There's a great picture of him standing in front of some palm trees doing his bit for some troops in the Pacific. So it happened. I just don't think it happened as much.
as much, yeah. Now, the biggest part of this we were talking before the show started is your research into it. And I thought we spend a little time talking about the research because
Sure.
having read through the book, it's vast research.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
Um, I'd be happy to kind of give the path I took. I found out about this real person, Jim Hetzer, who was an enlisted entertainer in World War II and worked with Mickey Rooney in Jeep shows. And I contacted his daughter. Jim was long gone. Uh, and I contacted his daughter, and she told me that Jim's older sister, her aunt, had saved every letter he wrote home from the war. And then also every letter he wrote home from New York before the war as he tried to make it in show business in New York. So I said, "Oh my goodness, do you mind if I come down to Dallas and take a look at these letters? I'll put on cotton archival gloves and I'll be very careful." And she said, "Oh, you don't need to worry about that. My sister published them in a book and put them on Amazon." So Just get the book. So I got this book and, primary sources, there's several hundred letters describing the details of what this life was like over in the European theater. And, we did this and we ate that, and our colonel did this, and, I saw that, and we smashed our Jeep, and, then we had to do X, Y. So I had a lot of primary source material. And I expanded from that and read some of the real classics of World War II reporting. Ernie Pyle was a journalist who actually was killed towards the end of the war, but Ernie Pyle wrote brilliant newspaper type stories, columns about the American war effort and specifically about the American GI. There's a brilliant, somewhat intimidatingly long trilogy of books about the war by an author named Rick Atkinson. And what I did is I cherry picked and I went in and read the parts starting in 1944, so that I would understand what was going on in great detail. I read many, many soldiers' letters that were published from other soldiers as well. And then specifically, I found a couple of very good books about the Battle of the Bulge and the defense of Bastogne. What I wanted to do, Thomas, was have, I'm telling a story. It's fiction. It's not nonfiction, so I'm not trying to trot out one fact or another. But I wanted it to be well researched so that people like you who are reading the story but know a lot would not see false notes in the story, but instead, say, yeah, that is true to how it was. So, making it fiction allowed me to tell it as a story. And you don't want your book to scream research. You don't want the reader to be, to say, yeah, boy, he knows a lot about the M1 rifle, but boy, it's holding up the story. Well, I'm not that interested. So you don't want to be screaming research, but you want to make sure your story rings true to what actually happened. Uh, and one of the things that I did, Thomas, for me, I'm curious and I love to do research. For me, research is easy and writing is hard. So being a human being, I put off the hard part as long as I could and did way too much research. So I had several chapters that my editor read and said, well, this is a great chapter about XYZ, but we cannot stick it in this book because the reader's going to want to follow the main story. So um, I had to cut a lot of uh, parts that I really, really liked and had done a lot of research for. The only good part about that is I got to keep the best stuff. So I had a lot of things. I had to cut a lot from it, but I got to keep the best stuff. So that's why I think readers of all stripes like the book.
Yeah, it reads really well. That's we were talking before the show. I am a huge history buff, and I love
Hmm.
reading. But yeah, some of those books get so technical. It's
Right, right,
so hard to
right.
go. If a
Yeah,
book flows well, I mean, I blew mostly through this book in a matter of days because it reads that well.
right.
It's a wonderful book. Um,
I think we have to thank my editor for making me cut things that were just would have been going on too long.
well, that's what they're there for.
That's why we
Um,
pay them.
you know, any anything that really surprised you when you were doing your research? I'm sure there was plenty. That's a
Yeah,
very vague question, I realize, but
yeah.
um,
Well, I some individual surprise. We talked about the Army as a cross section of America as a whole. I had never thought about that. So that was a little surprising. I didn't realize that the Navy and the Marine Corps were kind of cherry picked. Um, Secondly, I didn't realize how much frontline combat troops suffered. Obviously, we're all aware that they suffer from wounds and the threat of being killed or taken prisoner, but I didn't realize we did not rotate infantry divisions out of combat. So, as you probably know, uh, pilots, bomber pilots and fighter pilots were rotated back to America after a certain number of missions. And boy, those missions were absolutely harrowing. So, that was the right thing to do. And they were rotated back to the States and training other pilots, newer pilots. But America only raised 90 divisions, which sounds like a lot of soldiers, but is smaller than all the other belligerents armies. And so we could not rotate divisions out of combat or back home. And the only way to get out of the war, if you were in an infantry division, was to be wounded or killed or taken prisoner, or I guess get very, very sick. And the best equipment, the best clothing, the best food didn't make it up to the front line. Certainly, all the weapons made it up to the front lines, but a lot of things got kind of skimmed off in the rear echelons. It would have made life easier for the frontline soldiers, and that's probably the way it always is everywhere. So I was a little surprised at that, and it made me admire even more the combat infantry in particular and what they went through. And obviously, the Marines would have the same story in the Pacific. Um, the Battle of the Bulge, the fortitude and stubbornness of small individual units to hold off the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge, and basically foil their massive attack because they got put off their timetable. The German timetable for the Battle of the Bulge was very precise, and they had to make tremendous gains to meet their objectives. And they ran into isolated units of Americans who literally lasted, were overwhelmed, but lasted 3 days, 2 or 3 days, and held up crucial German units, especially in the north in Luxembourg and southern Holland. So that that surprised me. I got very interested in three pieces of equipment that, in some ways just seemed to embody so much. One of the things was I got very interested in the M1 field jacket. It was the, olive drab fundamental, issue of to an army soldier, and it had four huge pockets, two huge hip pockets and two huge breast pockets. And for the fighting men at the front, it was not only a garment, it was a suitcase. They were not interested in carrying a pack. They were not interested in carrying a gas mask in its container. They were constantly on the move, and they had to carry their whole life with them. And they just wanted it to be in their field jacket. And so they, if you put your hand in a pocket, there'd be a hand grenade and a toothbrush and a spoon in one pocket. And on the other pocket, there'd be three K rations and a letter from home. And, in a top pocket, there'd be some clips for their M1 and, maybe a sandwich that they'd made and saved for later. So I got very interested in that because it embodied the minimalism of the frontline soldier. I got very interested in the M1 Garand rifle, which was the standard issue rifle. It was an automatic rifle. You loaded a clip of, I think it was 6 rounds in a clip, and then you could fire them in very rapid succession. It There was there was a danger with the M1 rifle that inexperienced soldiers would fall victim to, which is when you loaded the clip, if you weren't careful with where you left your thumb, the bolt would close on once you jammed the clip in, the bolt would close very rapidly on your thumb if you left it in the path of the bolt. And this was called M1 thumb. And so even though I don't mention it by name, at one point I have the main character looking down at his bruised thumb and shaking his head. And then the last thing, the bazooka, which was actually called the M1 rocket launcher. The bazooka was the soldier's nickname for it. And the bazooka was sold to the soldiers in training as a tank killer. But the German tanks were very heavily armored, and the rocket that the bazooka fired was, it made an explosion, but it was not something that would penetrate the armor of a German tank. So um, the protagonist gets qualified in training as an expert in the bazooka, and then he spends the rest of the war trying not to be assigned to a bazooka in combat. Even and he finally does, but I got very interested. So that surprised me. Um, Maybe not as surprising, but kind of poignant. The only thing more important to the frontline guys, or really any soldier, than the entertainment was mail from home. Mail from home was just absolutely vital to morale. Again, it was easy to feel like you were forgotten, especially up on the front, that, what was going on back home in America, and who knew, and the army doesn't tell you anything anyways. So mail from home. And lastly, I will say um, the American economy produced incredible amounts of weapons and other equipment. We were coming off the Depression, so there was a big workforce available to work in the factories, and then half the factories were idle because of the Depression. And yet America had invented mass production of the automobile. So when the government started writing massive checks to buy jeeps and tanks and guns and ships, the American economy was ready and just produced an amazing amount of equipment and weapons. We supplied not only our own army, we supplied much of the Russian army, and we supplied a good deal of the British army after 1942, and all of the Free French forces that fought towards the end of the war. And there was a lot of stealing of equipment. There was so much equipment, it was kind of hard to keep track of. When you draft 8 million soldiers, you're going to get some bad apples in that 8 million. So there were soldiers that had been criminals, before they were drafted, and they were criminals while they were in the army. And there was tremendous amount of pilferage, not only minor, one unit would steal from another unit, and that was kind of just accepted, but also there was a huge cigarette ring in Paris with soldiers and even a few officers that finally got broken up. And there was 40 or there was millions of dollars involved, and dozens and dozens of soldiers were sent to the stockade as a result. So I was surprised at that, and I did put a chapter in when the protagonist is in Paris. His meal is interrupted by a crooked soldier who tries to wheedle him into uh, being corrupt himself. So that was so there. I learned some things. I don't consider myself a expert on the war overall, but I am an expert on this little bit of it.
Oh yeah. And it's plain to see your passion for it too in the writing. Um,
Thanks.
uh,
Thank you.
I really appreciate you taking the time coming on and talking to me about it. Real quick though, everybody, where
Yeah.
can you tell everybody where they can find the book?
Yeah. The book is on Amazon. Just enter Jeep Show Book, and you'll find it. It's available paperback and an ebook, a Kindle, and it's also available as an audio book for people that like to listen to books while they walk or do laundry or whatever. And then, so Jeep Show Book on Amazon. And then I do have a website where I put some extra material, and that is jeepshowbook.com. And if any of your listeners have questions or comments for me, they can reach me at that website, jeepshowbook.com.
And I'll be sure to post those links on our website when the
Oh,
show is
thanks.
when the show is out for sure.
Thomas, one
So
one more thing.
sure.
When you do a project like this, you come away with such respect for our veterans, the men and women who served in World War II, and all the other veterans, including the ones that serve now. So I got pretty inspired by that. I'm giving $1 per copy sold to an organization called Shield and Stripes, which is a startup program for veterans' mental health, to help struggling veterans kind of get their lives back on track after the service. So, I really came away with a deep feeling of, we just can't do enough for our veterans. And it's so, we send them into hazard's way. And then if we're not careful, we forget about them when they come home. And, they've been through it. So I think anybody that reads the book will come away with that feeling as well.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'll be sure to share a link for
Thanks. Yeah.
that charity as well, because that is very important, because sometimes they are more or less forgotten, and
Yes,
that is a
absolutely.
shame. So, but Robert, I again I thank you so much for taking the time. It was a wonderful conversation about your book.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Thomas. Really great to talk to you. I'm really pleased, and to your listeners. Thanks for the opportunity.